Hello and welcome back to Susanne Kurz Coaching. Death and Beyond, Part 4. In my last video, I told you that in my early 20s, I dropped thinking about and reading about death and near-death experiences because I felt it wasn't healthy for me and it wasn't good for me to think about death all of the time. And near-death experiences back then didn't have the potential to help me with that problem, mainly because I was so skeptical about what they could possibly mean for us. I also told you that years later, after a lot of things had happened, I went into a severe midlife crisis. That was around the age of 35. I had a crisis of meaning also. What is the meaning of life? And death is an integral part of this question for me. And therefore, I resumed researching the topic of death and also near-death experiences. And the first new book I bought and read back then was the book of Pim van Lommel, Endless Consciousness. This is the German translation of the Dutch original. And that was really recent research, really new back then. It's over 10 years now. But back then it was pretty recent and the newest thing, so to speak. I'm absolutely sure there is an English translation of this book too. And this book freed me from the fear of death in the way I had it before that. And I went around, after I finished this book, I went around and found looked at the sky and at the world and found everything so beautiful and so great. I was so light and free and happy. Pim van Lommel is a Dutch cardiologist, and obviously I can't report this whole book to you today. He touches on a lot of subjects and analyzes them, a lot of topics that are connected to near-death experiences, of questions that come up when you start dealing with near-death experiences and thinking about them, especially when you are after a scientific explanation. And he does that very elaborately and very systematically. He has done research on near-death experiences decades before this book. He was a cardiologist, worked as a cardiologist, and it seems that people whose heart stops sometimes have near-death experiences while their heart doesn't work. And so he came across that subject, and he actually did some research in the form of prospective studies. That's something else than retrospective studies. Retrospective studies deal with reports of something that has happened in the past. And obviously there is a lot more danger of problems creeping in and mistakes occurring and all that when you do a retrospective study. And so he designed prospective studies about near-death experiences. He also compared people whose heart had stopped, who had a near-death experience, with people whose heart had stopped, who didn't have near-death experiences. And he also compared what happened to them afterwards and what changes took place in their lives and how the changes in their lives differed and how they developed over a time span of something like 19 years, so long-term development. And he brings his results in this book. And he starts with concrete cases of that nature and his studies, and then proceeds to wider concepts and to parallels between consciousness and quantum physics, for example. And if quantum physics can even be applied to living organisms and things like that. He covers a lot of relevant topics systematically. So that's a really substantial book. Obviously, I can't report the whole book. So If you're interested, I would recommend you to read it yourself. And if I find it online in English, I will just put a link in the description so it's easier for you to find. In any case, I just want to explain to you what made this book so convincing for me. One thing is the person of the author. He is a cardiologist. That means he is a medical doctor who has been educated in the scientific system based on a very strict materialistic paradigm. And that means that it's tougher for those people, for a cardiologist like him, to come to completely different conclusions than what the materialistic paradigm dictates. So that's something that makes it very interesting for me and very plausible, because he is a person who comes from a similar perspective to mine, and something must have convinced him to think otherwise now. And so I'm always looking for those people. I've read other books, we'll come to that in other videos, who had a similar journey, came from a similar point as I did, and then were convinced otherwise. And so I'm looking for these people because I think, okay, if they were convinced otherwise, maybe what they have to say is going to convince me otherwise too. More importantly is that he explains very well what happens when your heart stops, especially what happens in your brain. And essentially what happens is that your brain doesn't get enough blood to function properly. And especially the higher functions that are necessary for any evolved consciousness and for clear contents of consciousness, like near-death experiences. These parts of the brain just don't work when your heart doesn't pump anymore. So your brain couldn't even generate hallucinations in that state, much less very clear contents of consciousness, as experienced by people whose heart had stopped and whose brain must have been in such a situation. And that's something he explains. He says, okay, on the one hand, that's what happens physiologically, so it's not very plausible that the brain can produce near-death experiences in that situation. The other point is, and that's interesting, in some cases, under certain circumstances, brain activity has been measured, and that also says, in these cases, there was no brain activity, especially not in the areas that are necessary for this sort of conscious experiences. So that means, from a materialistic point of view, near-death experiences in such situations are not possible, but they happen. So that's an interesting and very convincing point. And then there was another thing that he explains, and I think that was the first time I came in touch with this concept, and it's a concept of the brain. Now, usually we think consciousness is produced by the brain, because if you manipulate the brain, consciousness can change or vanish. And that suggests that the brain is the organ that produces consciousness. But there's another concept that explains this as well, but also can explain other phenomena about which we are going to talk in further videos, which cannot be explained if we assume that consciousness is produced by a working, functioning brain. And this concept is that the brain is a sender-receiver, much like a TV set, for example. It receives information in waves and translates them into pictures and sounds that is then emitted, that we can watch and listen to. Now, if your TV set is broken and doesn't work anymore, does that mean there's no program running? No, it just means you can't see and hear it with this TV set. And that's essentially how the concept of the brain as a sender-receiver works. That consciousness actually is something outside of the brain, or also inside, but permeating the brain, but independent of the brain, which is received and interpreted by the brain. So that's actually a stronger concept because it can explain more. That's something I learned from this book. And yeah, obviously, I still found some tricky points because, it could possibly be that someone whose heart stops beating and who has this sort of experiences still has some sort of brain activity that can't be measured by our devices, or and maybe the brain doesn't need what we think it needs to produce consciousness, but could still be the generator and the producer of consciousness. And it could also be that the time frame is different, and we also don't have measurements for all the people, of course. So there are a couple of points where you still can be skeptical and have doubt. And how I dealt with that, that's something I'll tell you in further videos. Hope to see you back again. Have a good time. Until then.